It was a cold evening in Johannesburg, the kind of cold that bites through your coat and settles in your bones. The wind moved with a whisper like it carried secrets. Steve Harvey had just finished a long day of filming, long lights, fake smiles, the usual grind of a television man who'd made a fortune off humor. But behind those purely white teeth was a soul looking for something deeper. He hadn't told anyone about the dreams. Not his wife, not his crew, not even his pastor, because who would believe it? For 3 nights in a row, he'd been seeing the same thing, a desert, silent, endless. And in the middle of it, a figure wrapped in white standing still, not speaking, just watching. Steve would wake up drenched in sweat, his heart pounding, the feeling of something ancient clutching his chest. He dismissed it at first. Jet lag, maybe the stress of shooting abroad. But the dreams didn't stop. They got clearer, more vivid. On the 4th night, the man in white finally spoke. Yeah, that's all he said, one word. And Steve woke up gasping for air, as if someone had said it straight into his ear. The next morning, he wandered through the city, alone. No entourage, no assistant. Just Steve, the man behind the fame, walking with a storm inside him. He ended up in a part of the city he didn't recognize. Narrow alleyways, cracked pavement, the sounds of life all around, vendors shouting, children laughing, someone playing a call to prayer in the distance. A small bookstore, tucked between 2 shuttered buildings, its windows dusted and old. Something pulled him toward it. Inside, the smell of paper and age wrapped around him like incense. The man at the counter was old, eyes sharp, face unreadable. He didn't ask Steve what he wanted, just nodded like he already knew. He walked to a shelf, reached high, and came back with a book wrapped in green cloth, placed it down slowly. The Quran. Steve didn't say a word. He just stared at it. Something about it felt heavy, not just in weight, but in presence. Like it knew things, like it had been waiting. That night in his hotel room, he opened it randomly. No bookmarks, no plan. Just let the pages fall where they may. The verse he landed on hit him like a bolt, and we have certainly made the Quran easy to remember. So is there anyone who will be mindful? He read it again and again. Each time it felt like it wasn't I him reading, like something was reading by him. He started crying, not the kind of tears that come from sadness, but the kind that happen when your soul remembers something it had forgotten. He called an old friend in the States, a man who had reverted to Islam years ago. They talked for hours about life, faith, the idea of divine guidance, that every soul is born knowing the truth, but the world buries it under ego, wealth, and noise. From that night on, Steve wasn't the same. He carried the Quran with him everywhere, not for show. He never posted about it, never spoke about it on camera. It wasn't for the world, it was for him. But there was one moment, quiet, unscripted. During a radio show in Atlanta, the host asked him offhandedly, "What's the most powerful book you've ever read?" Steve went quiet, his eyes shifted just for a moment. Then he leaned into the mic, voice low, almost reverent, the Quran. He said, "It changed how I see everything. It's not just a book, it's a light." And then he smiled, not the polished showbiz smile, but a tired, grateful one. No one in the studio said a word. For a full 10 seconds, there was only silence, not the awkward kind, the holy kind. And somewhere, maybe in a dream, the man in white stood once more. This time he was smiling too, his voice still echoing the silence of the radio studio. The words hung in the air long after the record button had clicked off. The audience, the host, the microphones, all frozen as though something unseen had rooted them in place. And for that moment, the polished lights of the studio seemed dimmer, as if awareness itself had shifted. Outside, Atlanta breathed its usual traffic hum, but inside, in that moment with him, time had changed. For Steve Harvey, something ancient had stirred. He left the studio that evening not quite the same man who had entered. The routine drive home became a procession of shadows and neon. Street lights reaching through tree branches, their phone screens and passing cars flickering like eyes. He saw them now, not just as part of the world, but as witnesses to the change. His reflection in the rearview mirror looked back at him, the same broad grin, the same tall stature, the same suit and tie. But something behind his eyes, something different, something unraveling. At home, the green-clothed volume lay on his nightstand waiting. He touched it almost reverently before sleep claimed him, and the dream came again. The desert. Endless, silent. But now the figure in white was not alone. A second figure emerged from a distant den, silhouettes against a midnight sky, light refracted off the sand as though the moon had fractured. The man in white turned, and the second figure offered a palm-open hand as if inviting Steve forward. The wind whispered in a voice he almost recognized as, "Come." Steve awoke gasping, his heart hammering. He felt he was on the edge of something neither comfortable nor familiar. The next day on set, he moved through the filming like a ghost. The crew noticed a difference: the usual quick wit, the staged laughter, the confident posture, all subdued as though he carried something heavy under his skin. The director called cut. Steve paused for a second longer than usual, stared at his mark on the floor, shook his head lightly as if dispelling a vision. Later, in his dressing room, he sat alone in the mirror's glow. A knock on the door, his assistant, cheerful as ever, asked if he was ready to go live in 10. Steve nodded, but his mind was distant. He clasped the Quran again, ran his fingers along the textured cover. The pages whispered like dry leaves. The earlier verse kept looping in his mind, and we have certainly made the Quran easy to remember. More than reading it, he felt it reading him. He felt the words carving channels in his soul. He wondered, what did the desert dream mean? Why the invitation? He tried to rationalize. Maybe he was exhausted, maybe fame, travel, production schedules, they all took their toll. But he sensed the rationalizing was weaker now. The unknown, the inexplicable, it had weight. That night after the show, when the applause had died and the stage lights gone dark, he wandered the corridors back to his hotel suite abroad. He paused outside a maintenance door. For a second, he heard the distant echo of the call to prayer, faint but real. He closed his eyes. The sound seemed to draw him in, deeper than sleep, deeper than his safe man world. He touched his chest and felt his pulse drop. The world had narrowed to that single vibration. This life and the life he sensed beyond. In the suite, he locked the door, drew the curtains, and sat with the book open on his lap. Candlelight flickered from the balcony behind him, shadow dancing against the walls. He read a passage, EFOU, who covers himself with a garment, i.e., while praying, arise and warn the people, and your Lord magnify. The language felt heavy, old, but alive. Words written long ago now echoing in his mind like footsteps in a vast hall. He felt a stirring of fear, not terror, but awe. Fear because he wasn't who he used to be. Awe because he sensed something calling him forward. He didn't know what the calling was, but it was real. Over the next few days, he carried the green cloth volume with him everywhere on set, in quiet corners between takes to the hotel lounge, even on flights between cities. His public persona, the laughter, the jokes, the bright facade remained intact, but behind the scenes, something else moved. Something soft, persistent, uncanny. At night, his dreams moved beyond the desert. He walked through ancient streets, sand-colored walls, archways, lamps burning amber, the faint scent of oud drifting in the air. He heard voices in the darkness, not speaking his language, but he understood the cadence, the intent. They pointed toward a city's ruin, toward a well in the earth, toward an open book lying on a stone altar. In a dream, he pulled the book forward and opened it. The pages were blank. Then letters materialized as he watched, glowing faintly. He looked around and realized the city was empty. No people, just empty lamps, empty archways, and sand drifting in the dusk light. He felt loss, deep, ancient loss. He woke up, face soaked, breathing fast. The tears came unbidden. Back in the daylight, he tried to shrug it off. He walked through airport terminals, flashing signs, people hustling. He looked at them and wondered how many were hungry for something they couldn't name. How many had a fullness they pretended not to feel, an emptiness they pretended not to know. It occurred to him that the fame, the stage, the applause, these were not enough. They never had been. One evening, after an overseas shoot, he decided to walk outside alone. He left the hotel quietly, without entourage or chauffeur. He wanted to feel the city, its streetlights, its breath, its secrets. He walked through alleys, past shuttered shops, neon signs flickering in a language he couldn't read. The hum of traffic faded behind him. He found a small cafe, its few tables half lit. He sat with a coffee and watched. The other patrons were quiet. The city's night lowered its voice. He noticed the old Quran tucked into his jacket and realized he had touched it on every flight, in every hotel. It had become an anchor. A man entered the cafe, his face half in shadow, his clothes simple but neat. He didn't sit. He stood at the corner table watching Steve. Their eyes met. The stranger didn't look away. Steve's heart skipped. The stranger smiled thinly and walked over, pulled out a chair, and sat without invitation. "You carry the book," the man said, voice soft. "It doesn't carry you yet." Steve's throat tightened. He tried to respond, but no words came. The stranger leaned forward. "It will require more than reading," he said. "Are you ready for more?" Steve swallowed. The cafe's soft music, the clink of cups, even the hum of the fridge, all fell into shadow. He felt as though some invisible threshold had opened. "What do you mean?" he asked, voice husky. The stranger's eyes glinted. "The book invited you into the dream. Now the dreaming invites you into reality. The path you walk is no longer safe for routine. You will be asked to step off the stage." Steve looked down, a lump in his throat. He thought of the green cloth volume in his jacket, the desert, the empty city. The figure in white. "What do you want from me?" he whispered. "Not what I want. What it demands." The stranger tapped the corner of the book peeking from Steve's jacket. "The truth inside will never be comfortable, but you must choose it." But then the stranger got up and left. Steve sat alone, the coffee now cold, the room stretched. He felt the walls breathe. He felt the city exhale around him. The stranger's words hovered at demands. He realized that the journey he had begun was not one of pleasant discovery. It was one of surrender, and the stakes were higher than fame, money, applause. They were eternal. That night in his hotel room, he opened the Quran again. He turned the pages slowly, aware that each flick had weight. He wasn't looking for verses now. He was listening for the voice behind the verses. He read "Indeed, we sent it down during the night of decree." And what can make you know what is the night of decree? The translation felt thin. The original rhythm felt deeper. He closed his eyes. He imagined the desert again, the figure in white, the second figure extending a hand. He realized the dread he felt was the same as the longing. Morning came. The tightness in his chest remained. On set, he engaged in his usual banter, but something about his laughter had changed. It didn't fill the room. It echoed in spaces. He sensed people watched him differently, as though the energy around him had shifted, as though they sensed something serious was beneath the surface. At dinner that evening with his publicist, he excused himself early, claimed fatigue. She assured him rest was good. He smiled appreciatively, then left the restaurant, walked alone through the city. He ended up at a mosque's outer wall by accident, just the sense of its minaret, the faint murmur of prayer slipping out into the street. He stood for a moment, watching the light on the mosaic. He didn't enter, but the invitation hovered. He felt as though he were half inside, half outside, a man in transit. Something inside him loosened, old fear sliding off. Then the phone rang. It was his assistant in the U.S., something urgent, a message from his friend who had reverted to Islam. They needed to talk. Steve took the call in his car, parked under a street lamp. The voice on the phone was low, concerned. "Steve," the friend said, "you have walked into territory that many avoid. The book you carry, its purpose is not comfort. It is transformation. What it asks of you now will be harder than what it has asked up to this point." Steve exhaled slowly. "What am I asking?" he asked. "Give yourself, without reservation. The dreams, the visions, they are doorways. The book doesn't just change how you see, it changes who you are. Expect the world to resist, expect confusion, but stay firm." Steve nodded, even though the friend couldn't see him. "I'm afraid." He admitted. "Good," said the voice. "Use that fear. Let it teach you humility. The true path isn't free of fear." They ended the call. Steve sat under the street lamp, his car silent, his chest tight. He touched the green cloth volume. Outside, the city's sirens and traffic resumed their rhythm, but he didn't move yet. Over the next days, the change grew. He found himself drawn into uncertainty. He turned down projects, not because he didn't believe in them, but because the call inside said no. He canceled a talk show appearance at the last minute. He asked his team to pause promotions. They were uneasy. They asked if everything was all right. He smiled and said yes. But inside he felt torn. Would the world of constant motion accept his pause? Would his brand survive the silence? Late one night, the dream shifted again. The desert was gone. Now he stood inside a cavern, stalactites hanging, water trickling into a still pool. The figure in white stood across from him on a rock island in the pool. The second figure from the earlier dream knelt by the water and scooped it into his hands, lifting it, letting it arc through the air like a fountain, then drink. The man in white beckoned. Steve stepped forward, the rock under his foot slippery. The cavern walls echoed with something, chanting, or a heartbeat. He reached the rock island, but as he lifted his foot, the rock shifted. The island cracked. The water surged. Steve stumbled and fell, the water pulling him forward. He closed his eyes and felt the cold. He woke up in his bed, clothes soaked, breathing heavily. The duvet turned back, the sheets damp. He sat up, his heart pounding. He realized the encounter had crossed into waking. The boundary between sleep and memory had blurred. He felt changed. In the following days, he felt a subtle change in his relationships. People he joked with felt hesitated around him. The latter seemed quieter. The photographers who took photos saw in his eyes something they couldn't name. His home life felt different. The laughter at dinner felt fragile. He found himself in the early morning hours awake, the book open, candle flickering, reading verses about guidance, about reflection, about the reality behind the illusion. Then one evening, while flying from one continent to another, the cabin lights dimmed for takeoff. Steve reached for the book. He tucked it in his lap. Beside him sat a young woman, a journalist he'd never met, traveling for a story. She glanced at his book. As that, she asked quietly. He looked at her, nodded. Yes. She smiled politely. What is it? Steve hesitated, then said, It's changed my life. She looked at him surprised, but she didn't press further. The plane took off into darkness. The clouds outside were deep and endless. Steve felt their mass, their quiet. When the plane landed, he felt heavier. Not physically, but as though the weight of something he could no longer ignore had become constant. Later that week, he received a letter. No return address. A single sheet of parchment paper, edges frayed. Inside was a quote, Waf. And when my servants ask you concerning me, indeed I am near. He felt a shiver. But he sensed it was part of this deeper unfolding. He showed no one. He looked at it privately. He realized the message was simple. Intimacy with the unseen demands courage. It was then that the next moment arrived. He was in Las Vegas filming a segment, late night. After wrap, he insisted on returning to the hotel by himself. The bright lights of the strip roared behind him. He found his elevator, entered. The door slid shut, empty. He pressed his floor. The elevator jerked, then another ding. The doors opened to a dark corridor, lights dimmed. Not his floor, strange. He stepped out. The corridor extended both ways in silence. No signage, he swallowed. The elevator doors closed behind him automatically, and the light above flickered. He walked. Every soft step echoed. He looked at doors on each side. Numbers faded. At the end, a single door glowed soft amber. He didn't remember this hallway in the hotel's layout. He hesitated. The pull inside him stronger than caution. He reached the door, and it creaked open. Inside was a small room, only a single lamp on a table and a chair facing a blank wall. On the table lay a copy of the Quran. Same green cloth, same texture. Steve's heart thumped. He approached slowly. The words on the spine were gold embossed. He touched them, opening the book. The pages were blank. He shivered. The lamp flickered. From the blank wall, voices began soft whispering. They spoke words he did not understand, yet his mind translated them. Awaken. Choose. Stand. The chair creaked behind him. He turned. The man in white stood in the doorway. The light behind him cast his face in half shadow. You read, the figure said, the voice low, ancient. Now walk. The corridor door closed. Steve felt the floor tilt, the walls breathe. He staggered, reached for the table to steady himself. The book slipped from his fingers, landing open at a page where words were now visible. Verily, with hardship comes ease. A flicker in the lamp. The cavern dream flashed in his mind. He saw the rock island cracking. He saw water surging. He saw himself falling. He was breathless. You will walk, the man said. Not as you were, but as you must. Steve nodded, though he didn't fully understand. The figure turned and walked out. The door closed. Steve was alone. The voices faded. The lamp steadied. The words on the page now seemed to glow faintly. He left the room, the hallway returning to normal as though nothing had happened, except he knew everything had changed. The elevator doors opened, and the lobby light was warm and familiar. The hum of Vegas resumed. People moving, left shoulders. Flashing lights. But Steve could feel the divide, the world as seen, the world behind the scene. Returning to his room, he found his assistant waiting outside. I thought you'd gone to bed, she said. Steve nodded and walked past. Once inside, he shook his head. I had to walk, he said quietly. His assistant sat on the edge of the sofa. Everything okay? She asked. Steve took a deep breath. I'm okay. He opened the Quran. He flipped to a random page. Then he turned to the heaven when it was smoke and said to it, and to the earth he come into being willingly or by compulsion. They said, we have come willingly. The verse struck him, not for its words, but for its echo of the unknown. He closed the book and stared into the cityscape beyond the window. The neon lights surged, the world still alive, still moving, and within him a silence, a promise, a path. In the following weeks, he began to act differently. On set, he no longer accepted scripts that felt shallow. He asked more questions, looked people in the eyes. In interviews, he spoke less about success and more about longing. His team wasn't sure what had happened. Some speculated fatigue. Others speculated a new project. But Steve knew this was not about the next show. It was about the next self. One night at home, his wife found him in their study. He sat on the floor, the Quran open before him, candlelight around. The room quiet. She approached, asked softly, Steve, what's going on? He looked up, the tired smile, the honest eyes. I'm reading, he said, and being read. She nodded but didn't press. She sat beside him. For a moment, they sat together, silence heavy, good. Outside the window, the city hummed, but here in the still room, a different hum, the hum of reckoning. 2 weeks later, he received an invitation, not a typical one, a quiet but urgent message come to Cairo. Little detail, just dates, a contact. He showed it to his friend, the one who had reverted years ago. The friend's eyes widened. Are you going? The friend asked. Steve hesitated, smoking thoughts, then nodded. I have to. The journey to Cairo was longer than expected. On arrival, he felt the hot desert air hit him at night. The city bristled with life and ancient stillness. He walked the narrow streets near Khan el-Khalili, only partly guided. The contact met him at the door of a modest house. Inside, the walls were bare. Warm light glowed. They sat with tea. The host, an elderly man, his skin creased by time, his eyes steady, asked no questions at first. Steve said little. He showed the green cloth Quran. The man nodded. Read it not just with your eyes. The man said, let it read you. Steve swallowed. He realized the words were the same, the voice similar, the weight of the book heavier than ever. That night he stayed in the modest house. In his room, as he drifted to sleep, the dream came again. But this time he walked alone through ancient Cairo. The minarets reached up like fingers scratched into the sky. A street vendor's lamp flickered. He turned a corner and found the well from his desert dream. The water glowed under the moon. He knelt and reached into it. The water was salt and sweetness, ancient and new. He drank. As he raised his head, the figure in white stood beside him. You chose, the figure said. No, live. Steve woke. Tears on his pillow. The quest had moved from vision to action. In the weeks that followed, Steve's life became quieter in one sense, louder in another. The camera still rolled. The lights still shone. But he carried an inner world now shifting. He began speaking to strangers about more than jokes. He asked colleagues about their hearts. He read the Quran in green rooms, in trailers, in airports. People noticed. Some asked. He didn't hide, not fully. But he didn't advertise either. He simply was present. And then the moment came. On a late-night flight back to the U.S., the cabin lights were off. Steve reclined, book in lap. He closed his eyes. The man in white appeared, not in a dream, but in his mind's eye. The figure pointed upward toward the sky. Steve followed his gaze. Outside the window, the stars seemed to pulse. A meteor crossed. Steve gasped. The unknown stretched out. In that moment, Steve felt he understood the book, the dreams, the corridor, the crossing. They were not random. They were initiation. The laughter and fame were not false, but insufficient. He felt he stood on a threshold between the world he knew and the world he was being invited into. When they landed, the lights came up and the world resumed its normal pace. Steve gathered his suitcase, the book snug in the pocket. He walked into the airport terminal, and the buzz of travelers, the announcements, the baggage claims, all felt like a symphony in which he was both conductor and listener. On the drive home, in his reflection, he saw a man shedding illusions. The smile was still there, but the eyes were quieter. They held some, maybe fear, maybe hope, maybe both. Back at his house, he opened the door and felt relief, like coming home after a long war. He went to his study, opened the Quran again. This time he didn't read any verses out loud. He sat, hands hovered over the pages, head low. He listened, he let the silence speak, and in that silence he heard his own voice, smaller, truer. He heard the voice ask, are you ready? He realized the answer, yes, but only if the path was the one behind the scene, not before the cameras. He realized fame was a tool, not the purpose. He realized the invitation would ask everything: time, comfort, recognition. And he accepted. He placed the Quran on the table next to his grandfather's watch and photograph, a reminder of where he came from. He looked at the watch. It ticked. Each tick a heartbeat. Each heartbeat a moment in time. He thought of the desert, the cavern, the well, the rock cracking. He thought of the figure in white, the second figure offering the hand. He thought of the silent city. And he stood, pulling his jacket off, hanging it on the chair. He walked to the window. Outside, dawn was breaking. The first blush of light. The city awakened. The world resumed. Inside, Steve Harvey was still on his journey. The book still held him. The unseen still called. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time he felt not alone. The figure in white had not left him. The dreams had not ended. The invitation still hung in the air. He took a deep breath. He picked up his phone and sent one message: "I'm in." And then he turned off the phone. He opened the Quran and read softly, his voice low. "And we made the night as a covering and the day for livelihood." The words wrapped around him like a cloak. He felt the promise of a new beginning. And outside, the city stirred. The world awaited. The book opened. The journey continued.